My name is Jelle Wieringa, Dutch name. I am responsible for PR here in EMEA and I'm a security awareness advocate. So basically what I do is talk to customers, talk to organizations about the need for security awareness and the need to protect the human and enable that human to make smarter security decisions.
Right. What do you have?
My name is Lydia Castablis and I'm the SVP for Emerging Technology Insights. In that capacity, what I do is I look at how we're seeing new cyber threats with new technologies.
Oh, great. Thank you. So I think KnowBe4 is known for phishing simulations is one of your key portfolios. Added to that, I think this is your new expansion into the Middle East. I think it just started in Dubai 2 years ago, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, so we've been here for a couple of years, but what you see in the Middle East that we've been, as an organization, globally expanding. And the Middle East has become such an important part of what we do that we decided a couple of years ago that we really need to invest time, money, resources to expand our business here as well. So that's the reason why you've been seeing a lot more of us.
Oh, good deal, guys. Okay, you understand phishing. You understand how it is one of the biggest threat vectors.
It definitely is, yep.
How do you differentiate if there is a different trend in the US and in the Middle East? Can you really differentiate, or it's all the same everywhere?
It's not all the same everywhere. The baseline is that about 70 to 90% of all successful cyber attacks start with the human. We see that globally. Right. But the differentiator here is that in some regions we see email phishing being the number one threat vector, whereas in other regions we see voice phishing or text-based phishing. Here in the Middle East, for instance, text-based phishing is a very big threat factor. We see a lot of emails being sent here, phishing emails, that focus on giving away free stuff, from getting a free pizza to getting a free iPhone, because that works very well in the region. And it's those little cultural differences that usually determine how social engineers and bad actors do their craft. They are really well fine-tuned to those differences per region.
Oh, right. Anything to add?
What I will also add is that really emerging technologies in this region in particular, they're well adopted, and you can see a lot of forward-leaning kind of thoughts and around edge technology. In that sense, I think that this region will probably be the first to experience kind of some of the new threats emanating from digital transformation, because they are doing it faster and more widespread.
Right. So you did talk about social engineering, right? And then how there is a cultural shift, an entirely different way the people are targeted here and the people are targeted elsewhere. So added to that, can you elaborate, or do you have any particular kind of an example that you remember?
Okay, so let's take, for instance, the new type of threats. What we've seen happening globally, but especially now in Europe, for instance, is the use of deepfakes within social engineering attacks, where they don't just send somebody an email, that's it. No, they actually try to build trust by adding AI-generated material, deepfakes essentially, to build those layers of trust within their attack so the victim is more easily swayed and manipulated. Now, one of the things what we see happening, that's in Europe already. There's been recent attacks where deepfakes have been addressed as primary vector. The one thing we know in the Middle East is there's a lot of money to be gained here, right? There's a lot of interesting victims for cyber criminals, unfortunately. One thing I can predict very easily is that digital media like deepfakes are going to be leveraged in the attacks over here. And it's with the recent, I think the recent expanse in organizations wanting to train their employees, what you'll see here is that the attacks that we see in the region will become more complex, both by deepfakes, both by the language thing. The language here is common. There's an entire region that speaks Arabic. That's an easy way for cyber criminals to basically, that's something that they can leverage. So we'll see more complex, more multi-layered attacks, leveraging new technologies. And that's what, well, my prediction here for the region. You want to add?
No, I think you covered that really well.
Great. Okay, what are the new interesting trends in phishing, particularly, that you have probably noticed in the last couple of months, probably post-COVID? especially in your research?
I think something with COVID that we've noticed is that the phishing attacks have increased, so that the number that we're seeing have increased, alongside the type of vulnerability being ransomware. So ransomware related phishing has increased, and then in terms of the type, well, you see the usual kind of whatever is hot, there'll be a phishing email around it. So for example, if there's a hurricane, around hurricane relief, any kind of disaster, war related, COVID related. So those are kind of things that we need to spot for. But because there's so often, that's a nice thing, because then you can say, hey, every time something happens, be aware of a phishing attack. So I'm hoping that people will start to see that more often and say, okay, well, I know this happened and now I need to be more aware already, because we're gonna see more phishing emails.
And what is right now the most current one?
I think every region is a bit different, and it's not just that. It's if you're talking about spear phishing, for example, you'll see that being more like precision phishing.
Right.
So that will be around C-suite, or could be admin user with a lot of credentials. But in terms of like the most thing, I can't say that I'm seeing one thing in particular. It's just kind of the usual ebbs and flows of it.
Right. Okay. Now you did talk about spear phishing, and that's a conversation that we always love to have. A CEO's attack. So now in such a scenario, what are the best practices that you think companies must can adopt? Because oftentimes CEOs are not that technically sound as a CTO or the CIO. So from that perspective, do you think what are the preparations that companies must have to ensure that the big boss is also safe as the lowest level employee?
Well, I think obviously technical defenses are important, and then having good policy is important. But cybersecurity is really a three-pronged approach. It's people, process, and technology. So if you've got the technology piece down, then you can't ignore the process, and then you can't ignore the people. So from a people perspective and the C-suite threat, I would say that just as the regular organization, everybody else has to be trained. I think that the C-suite needs to be trained. They should never opt out of it, and they should never feel that they can opt out of something like this, that it's below them, that everyone else is going to protect them. When it comes to spear phishing, the attacks are very credible. They write things that would make sense. They engage with the C-suite in a way that makes sense to them, or that would intrigue them. It would really make them want to click. And if you think about APTs, advanced and persistent threats, those kind of spear phishing are even more sophisticated, because they will take time to understand the life pattern of the individual and what would make sense and what angle to go by. And in that sense, sometimes even the family members could be a part of this, where they will find out what the family members are doing and use that as part of the phishing attack email. So I guess all in all, C-suite need to understand that they cannot opt out of understanding this, and security awareness for them is important as well. I don't know if Yella has something to add.
So the willingness of the boardroom to participate in security awareness, to be trained themselves, I think that's, at the moment, it's increased over the last couple of years. They understand that the organization is at risk, and when you think of risk, that's something that's a board game, right?
Right.
They think in risk. That's their bread and butter. Most C-level execs understand they need to be trained. That being said, is they need to make time to do it. It's not very labor intensive. It's not really, it doesn't take a lot of time, but that's where we as security practitioners also come in. We need to enable them. They understand why it's necessary. Now we need to make sure that they have the ability to do it. And that means that we in the security industry need to make sure that the messaging around phishing, spear phishing, why is it important to them? Do that in their language, make it a risk game, for instance. That's something that we need to do in order to enable them and help them, and the willingness is already there.
Okay, so you think finally cyber attacks is a part of boardroom discussion?
It should be, but I also think it already is, especially if you look at larger organizations. Today, they understand the risk of not actually thinking about it, right? You can ignore it, and that used to be the trend. If you do that today, your entire business is at risk. It's no longer just a computer being targeted. It's your entire network. It's your entire reputation that is at stake. And that's something that C-level understands very well.
Can you now tell me a little bit about the importance of phishing simulations across the companies, and then why is that right now one very important vertical that companies can invest in?
So phishing simulation alongside security awareness can help boost security culture. And that ultimately is the goal. So security culture is where you have an organizational culture that values security, that understands how it works, that understands threats, and they together collectively mitigate those risks. So one example I like to give is to say that if we know that USBs can contain a lot of malware and that it's not good practice to use them inside an organization. And so if one person were to say, oh, I'll put the presentation on a USB, if the other colleague says, no, that's not good policy, then you know that you've got an immune system.
Yeah.
That's the kind of the security culture that we're looking for, where if one person isn't fully aware, the other person can step in to stop that from happening. But when you have a collective awareness, that's where you can prevent attacks better than before. So phishing simulation helps people get used to these kind of threats in a safer way.
Okay, added to that, okay, how is the threat landscape right now evolving in the Middle East?
Complexity of the attacks, definitely. There's a lot to be gained here by cyber criminals, so they're willing to invest time, they're willing to invest resources, and that leads to more complex attacks, multi-layered attacks. That's what we're seeing today.
What about activism? Do you also find that, or do you also find state-sponsored attacks in the region?
That's a really tough one to say. So something that happened quite recently is some insurance companies, cyber insurance companies,
Right.
have decided that they were going to not offer insurance payouts for nation states.
Yes.
But the challenge there is, how do you prove or disprove that was the case?
Yeah.
And that is the million-dollar question. It's very hard to be able to prove or disprove that indeed it was coming from a state source. So in regards to your question, again, it is hard to know if it's coming from a state source or not.
Okay. So how much can regulatory frameworks and compliance come forward to basically solve a lot of problems? For example, is phishing simulation standard across the region, or cyber insurance necessary across the region? So okay, how do you think compliance can probably come into play here?
Well, compliance can definitely help get everybody up to a certain standard. I do like to tell people that there's no such thing as 100% cybersecurity. So what we're doing is we're mitigating and managing threats. And if compliance and regulation can help increase that threshold of what people need to do, I think we're gonna all be safer. I don't know if you want to add something to that.
So your compliance will never get hacked, right? It's the organization itself. Compliance is a framework that can help you define rules, define regulations. The thing though is, and I think that's happening here in the region very, very well, the governments are enforcing regulations, not just for you to be compliant, but for you to actually be safer. And what we've been seeing with security awareness training and simulated phishing is that it's part of all of the major regulations nowadays. It's organizations are stimulated through those regulations, through those compliance settings, to adopt it in their organization as well. And I think that's a really good trend that we're seeing. And again, it's not about the regulation itself, it's about being safe. And I think that a lot of organizations, especially in the Middle East, understand that part very well.
Okay, so I think in some way, I think phishing simulations can be in the bandwagon of red team attacks. So do you think the entire concept of red and blue mixing together and having those kind of drills very frequently should be a practice for organizations?
So purple, we're talking purple here basically. Yeah. No, okay.
I'm mixing colors.
To make it clear. So what you see with security awareness training is that as an organization, you can red team, blue team, purple team, doesn't really matter. It's all about motivating that end user, that employee to take part, because in the end, we're gunning for a change in behavior in that employee. They need to make better security decisions. That's what it's about. So personally, I don't really talk about the red teaming, blue teaming, or purple teaming. That's a trend that's definitely a good trend that organizations need to do. But it's all about getting that user motivated and involved in your security. And directly part of either red, blue, or purple, because that's usually an IT thing, right? Security thing. No, it's about that user and making sure that the user, the end user, understands his role, his responsibility, and that we in the industry and the organizations themselves enable that user. That's what it's about.
Anything to add?
No, I agree.
So lastly, can you let me know a little bit about the expansion plans that Nobico has and what's in store for you?
Did you or I?
Yeah.
There we go. So for us, it's actually very simple. We think and we actually feel that security awareness needs to be addressed more by organizations, and that's the goal of what we do, right? We try to tell organizations of its importance, and we try to influence their decision-making process to put more budget to it, and to do it in the right way, because it's simple. You can buy the tool, but that doesn't mean you're actually applying it right. So we try to help organizations with that. That's one of the major goals that we have here in the region, is to do a lot of thought leadership, to expand the messaging that we have, and to help organizations get into the rhythm of security awareness, because it's not something you do once, it's something you need to keep on doing. Otherwise, it doesn't really work well. So for leadership expansion is something we're doing. As a company, we're expanding in the region. We really feel that the maturity of the region when it comes to security awareness, it's here. People understand the risk of not doing it, sort of looking for solutions, and we're one of the key players in the industry for this. So we are expanding in here. We have our local offices, we're expanding the teams, and we're doing basically the same as we do on a global basis as well, is we try to help our customers to do a better job at security awareness training.
I think one question to you, because one thing is it's cyber awareness month. Okay, so a couple of tips that you think organizations should have, and next thing, more importantly, I think over the last 5 years or so, there's been a lot of noise around women in cybersecurity. You are here, and it's one of those great examples, and I'm very happy with it. So, in that perspective, where does education towards cyber begin? Does it should it start at home or towards college? How do you groom young kids into this domain of cybersecurity?
Well, I agree with this approach that you need to start young. That's important. So when it comes to kids and cyber education, I do think that parents play a role, but ultimately I do think that governments play a role in asking the public education infrastructure to provide that. And this is something actually that we advocate for at the United Nations. We believe that cybersecurity awareness is a form of cyber capacity building, and that children should be exposed to that, because we're living in digital economies, and all of our, not just our jobs, but the way that we're gaining revenue as nations is increasingly from digital spaces. And also think about smart infrastructure, the wearables, and the smart cities and all that. We are growing in a world where our kids are seeing that the world is digital, but we're not giving them the tools to understand how to protect themselves if we don't provide that at school. So we can't rely just on the parents. The parents should definitely be informed. Schools have a huge role to play, and government has a huge role to play in that for kids.
So, and I think, do you also believe that that is the end solution to the skill gap that the industry right now faces, or there could be more?
Well, the skills, so we're talking two separate things, right? So with children, them understanding being cyber savvy and all of that, that's a new life skill that they need to have. We all do, not just kids. But when it comes to skills in the labor market, then we need to look to universities and ask ourselves, if we have new students that come out of university and they don't have the skills we need, what's wrong there, and how can we fill that gap by providing whether certificates or on-the-job training? And then also we can also ask ourselves, does a 4-year degree really matter for all the jobs that we're looking for? Sometimes all you really need is expertise in a certain particular software or network. And so some companies, cyber companies, are looking to have apprenticeships where they just take you out of high school and teach you what you need to know for that particular task. So the landscape of cyber education for skills in the labor market is changing right now.